Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out on an evening where you don't want to take one of those double dog dares and stick your tongue to a light pole. It is cold. So, my name's Jim Rada. I was asked to be your speaker this evening. And we're going to talk about some of the stories of Deep Creek Lake that I featured in my book, Secrets of Deep Creek Lake. And obviously in honor of the centennial of the lake hydroelectric plant starting up. That's what's considered where they do the start date from, which was May 26th of 25. So coming up on that, the actual anniversary. However, many of you may know that the lake was in construction for 2 years before that. So it did actually start in 1923. But nowadays, it is something that I realize that nobody alive has a memory of Garrett County not having a lake. And it is a big one. It is Maryland's largest freshwater lake, 3,900 acres. So, and definitely has a big impact on this county. But there are a lot of neat stories about it that I am still looking and searching for neat stories. So the first one, so here's a quick map, just to give you an idea of all the little crevices it goes into. So that's the interesting thing about a lot of these man-made lakes. They just have these, weird appendages almost coming off the main bodies because it's just filling in the low ground areas. Oops. We'll get to that one. My finger's too quick. So the first thing is with Deep Creek Lake, it is actually, a lot of these man-made lakes, they're built on top of towns. Youghiogheny Lake, the Youghiogheny Lake is built on top of a town up there. And you could see it recently. You could see the old bridge and things like that. Is it still exposed up there? Does anybody know? Did it start to fill in? It started to fill in. Okay. Yeah, I saw that back in the 90s one time when the lake was down and you could walk down, see the streets, see the old well foundations, the old home foundations. But with Deep Creek Lake, they moved about 50 buildings out of the lake area when they were getting ready to fill it in. But what they didn't move were 2 other man-made lakes that were in that area. The first one is called Lake Cleveland. And it gets its name from President Grover Cleveland, who spent a day of his honeymoon at Deer Park going out to this lake to fish. Here's a drawing that was done for the White House Press Association. You can see the reporters there watching him fish and his newlywed wife fish. Interesting, I just noticed she's the only one that's got a fish. And you got Cupid in there too, although I'm not sure how happy she would have been to be fishing on her honeymoon. But this lake was built in the late 1880s. Gus DeLauder became the Maryland Commissioner of Fisheries for the region of Maryland west of Baltimore. And he was tasked in part with trying to find a way to reverse Maryland's declining fish populations. So he came up with the idea of doing fish hatcheries. And he got the support of the governor and actually a man named Robert Roosevelt, who was Teddy Roosevelt's uncle. And he also, Robert had pioneered some fish hatcheries up in New York, so he had the expertise to help DeLauder get his project going. So DeLauder bought up 1,000 acres out here around the area where Deep Creek met Cherry Creek. And it's out near where would have been where the Thayerville Cemetery is now in that area. And the creeks were dammed and a mile-long lake was formed that was 1/4 mile wide at its widest. It was estimated to cover about 45 acres. So it was barely more than 1% of what Deep Creek is today. And he kept it stocked with 50 to 60,000 fish annually. He stocked it with brook trout, rainbow trout, and landlocked salmon. And fishermen started flocking to the area. Fishing was said to be really good. You can easily catch a 3-pound trout. And so as the popularity grew, you started having the lake become one of this county's early tourist attractions. So it was bringing people in who wanted to fish, and DeLauder decided to build on that reputation. He built a lodge, a 10-room lodge, had some outbuildings, had an ice house, had buggy house, a garden, so the residents who were staying there could go out and pick fresh vegetables to eat along with the fish they caught. Of course, it was right on the lake, so they had boats there that they could rent. And, turned out to be a big success. People came out for it. So much so that the Cumberland Times-News reported in 1889 that people were actually starting to build summer homes out here in Garrett County. So kind of a precursor to Deep Creek. So it was such a success that he bought some additional land about a mile away from Lake Cleveland with plans to build another lake. However, in the interim, before that second lake could be started, he was replaced in his position with a friend who was named Richard Browning. Was it the great-grandson? Grandson of Meshach Browning. And he became the new Maryland Commissioner of Fisheries. He took over, he was in agreement with DeLauder's vision, so he built this second lake. Was again about a mile long, but only 200 to 300 yards wide at its widest, and it was south of where the Glendale Bridge is today. And on some, initially it was just called State Lake on some of the old maps, but they eventually named it Lake Brown in honor of the governor at the time. And so both of those lakes were there and in existence when Deep Creek started filling up. It's said that some of the structures built to dam the rivers for those lakes is actually still underwater there. So Deep Creek is actually a lake on top of two lakes, so a stacked lake. Now, speaking of stacks, as you saw, you got this. So who remembers the old commercial for Big Mac? Anybody? Yes. Man, that like became a mantra. I remembered it too. And, Big Mac is well known today. They sell about 550 million of them a year, it's said. But it first appeared on a McDonald's menu in '67. So actually within my lifetime, there was a time before Big Mac that when I was a little baby that I would have known of. When it first appeared, it only cost 45 cents, which is about a 1/12 of what it costs nowadays. And when it did first go onto the menus, there was some trepidation because they thought that McDonald's customers would balk at the price because McDonald's at the time was selling hamburgers for 18 cents. So, it was a gamble for them. And the guy who invented this is a man named Jim Delegati. Anybody recognize that name? I see some nods. Yeah, he's generally associated with Pittsburgh, but he did a lot to help develop the Deep Creek Lake area. And his first McDonald's was opened in '57, and after about 10 years, he had about 12 McDonald's. He was, they were going all right, but he came up with this idea for a double patty hamburger. And he pitched it to his regional manager, and the regional manager, bought into the idea. So he allowed Jim to test market it in one of his stores, his Uniontown store, with the caveat that he had to use already approved McDonald's ingredients. Turns out that wasn't going to work. The buns weren't right size for the burgers that Jim had envisioned, so he went rogue. He made an agreement with a local bakery, bought some oversized sesame seed buns, sliced them in thirds, and used that as the basis for the Big Mac. And it became an immediate hit. After 2 years on the market, Big Mac was making up 19% of all of McDonald's sales. By then, it had just started rolling out nationwide. So, this made, of course, Delegati made money from it, and certainly helped his reputation, certainly helped his restaurants. Since his restaurants were the first ones who had it the first couple years, and the only ones that had it the first couple years, his restaurants suddenly went from being some of the lowest performing restaurants for a major city to the highest performing restaurants for a major city. And he held on to that title for a few years. But it allowed him to also, the success of those sandwiches allowed him to add to his chain, so he eventually owned 48 McDonald's. And they, was quite well off. Then he turned his attention to Garrett County and McHenry area. He had a summer house here, as many people did, but he started investing in businesses. And he was either the owner or the partner in a number of businesses that are still operating today here. Uno's Pizza, Arrowhead Condominiums, the Honey Honey Bar, the Garrett 8 Cinemas, the Arrowhead Market. And he had a hand in that. He told the Cumberland Times-News in 1994, "We've been coming here for 35 years. We love Garrett County. My wife remembers the old Blue Barn, and we wanted to do something to help the county." So when you go see that little area around the Wisp and all, and Arrowhead Market, I guess that's pretty much where all those businesses are, right around the Arrowhead Market now. So and that all the Big Mac guy helped start all those up. So there's a shot of Jim with his featured sandwich. He also, by the way, created the sausage and pancake breakfast for McDonald's and started one of the first Ronald McDonald's houses. So he had a lot of interest. It was also said that he ate a Big Mac a day. And he lived to be 98, so maybe there's something to it. You don't see that being pitched when they pitch the Big Macs anymore. Now, while Deep Creek Lake can be certainly considered a county treasure, even a state treasure, it's not typically what's going to spring to mind when you talk about treasures. But the county actually has its lost treasure stories, and some of them may actually be under the lake if they exist. Now, one of the earliest is, at least in terms of silver, is Lehman's lost silver lode. In the early 1800s, a man named George Lehman, he went out hunting one day, and we know it was in the northern county area, around where the lake is, but we don't know exactly where. He went walking on his hunt, searching for game. We know he went south and west towards what's now the lake, and he got lost. He just was out there wandering so long, he got lost. He sat down at one point to try and refresh himself, get his bearings back. He found a spring, so he sat down next to the spring, was drinking some water, and he realized there's this weird rock near the spring that never seen its like before. It had a different sort of look and color to it and a sheen that, it caught his attention enough that he knocked a chunk of it off, stuck in his pack. He thought, be a neat thing to display. So then he started out trying to find his way back again, and this is obviously before cell phones, and you don't have MapQuest to get you back. You can't even say aim towards, aim west and you'll hit 219, aim north and you'll hit, 40 type of deal. He was just, wandering until he could find some kind of landmark he knew. And he eventually came across a farm that he recognized, and from there he was able to get home. Now at the time, he didn't think much about what had happened to him. He put the rock on his mantle, thought it would be an interesting conversation piece for friends, and pretty much forgot about it. But one friend came by who saw it and realized that it was a chunk of silver. And he urged Lehman to get it assayed. He did. It turns out that there was enough silver in it that would be worth about $270 today. So he had the silver minted into coins that he gave to family members. Now, knowing that this was just one piece of a larger chunk of silver he'd seen, he started trying to find that silver lode. And he couldn't. He searched all kinds of variations, went back to the farm, which was, that one place he'd seen before that he finally recognized after he'd been lost, and tried to work backwards from there. He just was not able to find it ever again. In fact, by the time he was dying, he told his family everything he knew about, because he knew it was there. So he told them everything he could remember about where that spring was, which wasn't much, and urged his family to keep trying to find it, and no one has yet to find it. So it is still out there. Now, it's said that story of his lost lode of silver attracted some speculators to the county from Arizona. And they came and they said they discovered silver on Hiram Duckworth's farm. They decided to form a mining company and start this operation to mine this silver. They capitalized it, selling $5 shares. They made $250,000 to start their business. And it was said that a lot of the Georges Creek and Lonaconing bankers invested heavily in this operation. In fact, a lot of the miners became some of those early employees. The problem was when these miners went to work, they found virtually no silver. It was never a profitable mine, except for the two owners who made that $250,000 selling the shares. So the mine closed up pretty quick. The owners of the mine, they disappeared with the money they had. And so that one, technically was silver. There was at least a little bit of silver there. But a couple years later, nearby, in Bear Pen Hollow, there was more silver found. And Sam Miller opened a mine. It was a single shaft down with some shafts that ran off. So you had to descend by a ladder and go into the areas and mine. And it did produce silver, but it was a seam that petered out pretty quickly. So again, it was not a very profitable one. Then years later, on another Duckworth property, this one was Israel Duckworth, his wife had a dream 3 nights in a row that if he dug near a particular log that she'd seen in this dream in the woods, that he would find silver. So she persuaded him to go out and do this. And so he found the log, he dug, and he did find silver. And it seemed like a pretty good lode. He opened up the Bell Mining Company, but again, it petered out supposedly pretty quickly. So, as Victor Harvey wrote in the Glade Star, first, it is true there really is silver in Garrett County. To what extent is not known. Now, as far as gold goes, the possible gold in this county, that's a whole different story, one you probably heard, which is Braddock's lost gold. 1755, General Braddock was at Fort Cumberland. His aide de camp, George Washington, brought in a chest of gold coins. There was going to be payroll for his army. But they left Fort Cumberland on June 6, 1755, heading towards Fort Duquesne, which is roughly Pittsburgh nowadays. The precise routes unknown. It said it roughly paralleled the National Road. They did make 4 stops, known stops between Cumberland and before they were attacked by Indians along the route. Now, before that Indian attack, they had made the decision they were going to split the army up a bit, the idea being for the soldiers, the hardy soldiers, the fighting ones, the fast-moving ones, to head off to Fort Duquesne, to engage the French out there. Meanwhile, the men who were in charge of supplies and things like that would bring up those supplies as fast as they could, but it was going to be slower than the fighting men, the infantry and the cavalry. So the group split up. Somewhere along that route between Garrett County and Fort Duquesne, they were attacked by Indians. 500 soldiers were killed, another 500 wounded, just 300 survived without any harm. It was pretty much a massacre, since only 28 Indians and Frenchmen were killed. The gold was never seen again. It was said that it was buried somewhere along the route near a river that forked. People have searched since then and have not found it. So again, and there's been all kinds of stories and rumors abounding. The creeks that form Deep Creek are possible places where it could have been buried, but if so, it's now under water and probably will never be found. Anybody recognize this man, just out of curiosity? Okay, good. You remember his name? Very good, yeah. Okay, so this man's name is Frank Olson. Back in the 50s, he worked in what was called Camp Dietrich. It's now Fort Dietrich nowadays. And he was starting to have reservations about his work that he did there. But in 1953, he was persuaded to attend kind of a working conference out here at Deep Creek Lake at a cabin on the lake, not far off. They said about 100 yards off of 219, about 30 yards from the lake. And he was there with about 8 or 9 other guys who had been brought in. They had been brought in under the cover. The press was told that it was a winter meeting of scriptwriters, editors, authors, lecturers of sports magazines. And the people who were there were members of the Special Operations Division at Camp Dietrich and the CIA. And they were told they were there to discuss things like biological warfare and mind control drugs. However, that was also a cover, because what they did, unbeknownst to these men, was they dosed them with LSD. They were guinea pigs. And it is said to, at least initially, it was said to have had some side effects on Olson. So, he was persuaded to go visit a CIA psychiatrist in New York. And sometime during that visit, he was said to have been affected so much that he jumped from his hotel window, plunged to his death. Now, they knew, even within a couple weeks, the CIA knew from their own investigation that LSD had an effect. Their own report said that it was, a direct causal connection between that experiment, the one here at Deep Creek Lake, and his death. They only told his family that he died in relation to his work so that they could collect federal death benefits. But then about more than 20 years later, a presidential commission that was investigating the CIA found in their investigation that what was listed as an Army scientist had fallen to his death from a hotel room in New York. So they realized that was Olson, and that's when the LSD connection came out. The family sued the federal government, and they were actually, here's his family meeting with President Ford, they won a $750,000 settlement from the government. That's mid-1970s dollars, so a few $1 million today. However, his sons, Olson's sons, were still not satisfied that they knew the whole truth. And so they were able to get an investigation into their father's death reopened, and a new autopsy was done on the body that found that Olson had had a blow to the back of the head before he fell from the window. So it wasn't enough to firmly say that he'd been killed and thrown from the window, but it was enough that the cause of death was changed from suicide to unknown. And there's still actually some the litigation was dismissed about 10 years ago, that the filing had been too late and kind of superseded their secondary lawsuit had been superseded by the first one where they'd settled with the government. So again, that dismissal did not say that CIA didn't kill Olson. So apparently, there is that shadow still hanging over his death of how he really died. And of course, getting out a window that high in a New York high-rise would have been, hotel would have been interesting too. Now in the late 1960s, 219 had to be realigned and also widened for all the tourist traffic that was coming through the area. So the S.J. Groves Company was hired to move the highway off of its current alignment at the time to its current location. The day that the company showed up to start work on this realignment, a man named Skeeter Bowman went out, met them, had them halt their work while he got in a plane and took off from an airfield right there at the lake. And he made them wait until he took a nice flight around and then landed. That is considered the last flight out of the county's first airfield. And Skeeter Bowman had been his family farmed that area. The airfield was on his family farm. He was a gunner during World War II, had earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal. Rose to the rank of Staff Sergeant. So he had flight experience. When he returned home, he decided he wanted to, continue flying, so he convinced his family, who wasn't quite as actively farming the property, to give at least a little bit of it over for an airfield. He opened that airfield up to anyone who wanted to use it. He didn't charge them. It was just a grass landing strip. Didn't have lights. Initially, it didn't have a hangar. You could tie up your plane next to the airfield. And he did keep fuel in 55-gallon barrels there that any of the pilots could buy. So early on, you didn't have too much heavy usage. You had some business people flying in, primarily from Pittsburgh. You had occasionally a farmer would have his crops sprayed, so that airstrip was used by those planes. It was also, Skeeter himself said that he always told people he started the first air transit freight service for Garrett County because he used to fly down to Baltimore to get boating supplies and things like that and bring them back to the county on his own dime. So The question is, and there's still some questions about when it actually started. They think it's around the late 1940s. It would have been after he came home from the war. But 1946, there's an aerial photo that doesn't seem to show an airstrip there. It also doesn't show on the 1949 U.S. Geological Service map, topographical maps. It does start showing up on air charts in 1954, but they do know that it was in use before then. So somewhere in that area, in that time frame, late 1940s, is when it actually started going into operation. 2,300 feet long. As I said, it was grass. He did have an orange windsock so that you could see what direction the wind was blowing. He said he never did it to make money. It was pretty much so he could do his own flying. But, no field lights. You could land at night, but it was said that to do that, you had to have cars out on the airfield with their headlights on to show you where you were coming in at. And not too many people did that. It also had a slope to it. It was 100 feet difference. So if you were landing, you were actually coming in and going downhill. If you were taking off, you were going uphill, which kind of complicated things. Apparently, a lot of landings, the pilots didn't really adjust for that additional acceleration that the downhill would give them on their landing, and wound up going, tipping over. So but it operated. It was the only thing around for the service. It was, as tourism picked up on the lake, a lot more business people who had summer homes started using it. And that kind of led the county to eventually open the airport that you now have. But before that, he did build a 40 by 60 foot hangar, which still exists. And you can still see his airplane. It hangs in Bear Creek Traders. I would guess some of you have been in there. But if you go in there, look up, and you'll see, the plane you see will be his old Piper Cub that he used to fly. And it's not really big, so. But, he wasn't doing a passenger service or anything. It was for his own fun. But now, part of that airfield is underwater, and part of it's at the fairgrounds. Some of it's on the other side of 219. Not too much of it remains anymore. Now, for a couple of the famous people who have been out here, I would guess you all recognize this gentleman. Here's a nice shot of him out on the lake, having fun. Still, his hair is always never combed. When he needed to clear his thoughts in the 1940s, and get away from the hustle and bustle of his notoriety that he had gained, he came top secret vacation here at Deep Creek Lake. It wasn't, it was truly top secret. He was considered a national asset. It was not known generally that he'd been here until the 1970s, when the Cumberland newspaper came across the story and investigated it. But he was invited out here by John Stedding. They came out, spent a week out here, or 2 weeks out here, and he would take daily walks around the lake, or around that section of the lake where he was staying. He would talk to people just casually. He'd meet. At times when he would disappear and nobody could find him, they'd say, well, check and see if such and such's boat is still at the dock. And they would find it was gone because he would have taken it and gone out on the lake just to be out there. He liked sailing. He liked the relaxing, being out there on the water, just the gentle rock of the boat. It let him clear things, clear his head out. He actually told one of the people he was staying with that here you can get nearer to God. That was one of the reasons he liked it. So also during that visit, John Stedding's brother Fred asked him to explain that famous theory of relativity. And so Einstein, and he asked him to explain it in layman's terms so Fred could understand it. So this was how Einstein explained it to him. He said, put it this way, if you sit on a park bench with your sweetheart, an hour seems like a minute. If you sit on a hot stove by mistake, a minute seems like an hour. And that was his explanation for the theory of relativity. I still don't understand it. I don't know how that relates to E equals MC squared, but that, he saw that. He was also apparently a very generous guest. When he left, he tipped a man named Blair Thompson, who'd been kind of his attendant during the time there, $50, which today would equate to $1,000. So pretty darn good tip. Now, let's see, I'm going to jump over and anybody recognize this guy? So, anybody ever get a polio shot when they were kids? Yeah? The guy with the glasses, Dr. Jonas Salk. He became famous in '55 with that polio vaccine. And up to then, polio would kill thousands of kids annually and deform thousands of others. In 1954, the year before that vaccine started, there were 38,000 new cases of polio reported in the US. In 1961, so 6 years after the introduction of the vaccine, new cases had dropped 97%. So definitely a very effective vaccine, although not, totally, but it did a lot better than a lot of vaccines. So once he became famous because of this, became a public figure, he started having to do a lot of traveling, a lot of talking. It really affected his family life. And so Deep Creek Lake, which he was introduced by some neighbors in the Pittsburgh area, coming out to visit them here at the lake, and then eventually buying his own property, it became a getaway for him, a place where the press didn't follow him generally. His wife said that he'd love to come out here and just take long therapeutic walks. It was actually said that during one of these walks is where he came up with the idea for what would eventually become the Salk Institute. He even thought about building it here in Garrett County before deciding to do it out in California. So he bought his property in 1957. He'd first come here in '55 when the vaccine was introduced. 2 years later, bought his first property. They built a home. So they would come out for the summer, do a lot of sailing, as you can see, barbecues, a lot of family time. One of his sons was big into theater here, and it was time that his kids would later very fondly remember with their dad, because when he wasn't here, he was usually at work, being swamped by reporters, traveling overseas, giving talks. Even when they traveled overseas, they didn't get to see their dad much, even though they went with him. So this was a getaway for the entire family. And then in 1962, turned out to be the last summer they came to Deep Creek. And that was also the summer where Life magazine came out to do a photographic essay of him. This is one of the pictures that was in Life magazine. If you can find those old issues of Life, you'll see pictures of him doing the barbecue and swimming and things like that with the family, doing a lot of that family time. But following this last summer that you're looking at, in the interim, the Institute got opened up in La Jolla, is that how you pronounce it? California, and they wound up moving out there. And so he sold the house here. But yeah, you can be happy that this was a place that he and his family considered a refuge from the hustle and bustle of the world. Okay, so I think I'll close it off with that. And anybody have any questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Where was this house?
I want to say Turkey Neck. Let me see if I can find, if I wrote it down. I am not seeing it right now in my notes. Come on. I thought Paradise Point. That's where they bought their property. That's all it said. There was a short blurb in the Republican that said the Salks had purchased property on Paradise Point, and were planning to build a home there. And that ran in 1957. So I guess if you dig deeper into the land records, you could figure out which lots. But at the time, that's what the paper reported. So. Yes, sir.
Now you mentioned that the original hangar from the airstrip was still here. Is that part of the fairgrounds?
It's actually on the other side of 219, behind one of the gas stations, they said. I don't have it in my notes exactly. Well, maybe I did. Let me see if I did write it down precisely where. But they do know which building it was. Is it part of the fire hall? Let's see. Yeah, I just wrote down that the hangar, it's between 219 and Deep Creek Drive, surrounded by some other structures on the other side of 219. Some of the parking area of the fairgrounds was also part of the landing strip. So, anyone else?
I don't want to know your secret.
I like to go perusing old newspapers. That's the main place I'll find stuff. The airfield story I found by going in Bear Creek Traders. Some of the other stories I've picked up on Salk. I believe I found that going to the Transportation Museum in Oakland. And I saw a picture and researched that. The Einstein story was told to me by Stedding's son, Robbie Stedding, who gave me a picture of him sitting on Einstein's lap when he was like 2 years old. So, but most of them, let's say 90% of the stories I find just by going through old newspapers and seeing what catches my attention. And then the others come from, leads that people give me, or just odds and ends, places where I come across something, and I start to follow it up. Just, Well, actually, I did like 10 years as newspaper reporter for different papers, and I have 2 investigative journalism awards. Because I like digging into the whys and wheres and things like that. I find it fun. I've got a book that's supposed to come out later this year that I'm really having fun with the research on, because it's a neat story. The first hanged murderer in Allegheny County was the Washington County Sheriff. And so I'm having a ball researching that, because I'm going off on all these rabbit trails. I'll research a certain person involved and find out all this weird stuff about them. I've found related to that a ghost story, a connection to a president of the United States, something really awful that happened to this guy's brother because of the hanging. Just a lot of odd stuff that all ties back into the story. So it's, and every time I find something new, it's just fuel for my fire to keep looking for something. So, yes?
I've seen the picture of Einstein with Henry Ford here. Do you have any backstory on that?
You're probably talking about not Einstein with Ford, but Edison with Ford, Firestone, and Burroughs. And that's actually one of the stories in the Deep Creek book. That they have the big way marker over by Swallow Falls, talks about it. They were here 2 different years. And they were early glampers. They called it camping, but when you read, they traveled with a whole entourage. They didn't have to set up tents. They had people setting up their tents, laying out, multi-course meals, bringing in horses, bringing, all kinds of stuff. But they camped out by Swallow Falls both times. There's different stories about, things that they did while they were here. One of the bridges collapsed while they were trying to drive across it, so they wound up having to have their entourage tote everything across the creek to set up things. But yeah, they liked it out here. They would travel every year. That group would do a big glamping trip, big camping trip, staying at different locations. And so they came through, they stayed at Deep Creek, and they would go, there was no Deep Creek at the time, but there was Swallow Falls. I keep saying Deep Creek. From Swallow Falls, they'd go south through Oakland, down into West Virginia. I'm trying to think, was it Elkins? I think they may have stayed at Elkins. They just made a big loop. It was a big deal. On one of their trips, the second one, but before they got to Garrett County, when they were still camping down by Big Pool in Washington County, they actually had President Harding come out and join them for a night, because he was friends with them. So he came out, spent the night with them, and then he couldn't continue with them because he had duties. So he went back to D.C. the next day, and they continued on, came out here to camp here the next night at Swallow Falls. So. Anyone else? Okay, well then thanks for having me out this evening. Hope you enjoyed it.